Hello, my name is Osha. I enjoy talking about American presidents, and today I want to continue my discussion on Alexander Hamilton, who was our first uh, Secretary of the Treasury. He was not a an American president, but his philosophy of government, of course, uh, significantly influenced our presidents from our first president, George Washington, to John Adams and John Quincy Adams, and even his political opponents. They would eventually exercise his philosophy of government for a very robust federal executive. That included Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Andrew Jackson, and so on. So um, now I want to talk. Again, of course, I admired Alexander Hamilton a lot, and of course, the the main text that I'm drawing a lot of what I'm talking about from, is from the paradigmatic work of Ron Chernow, Alexander Hamilton. They since made a Broadway musical on this work, and there have been other successful writings, publications on Alexander Hamilton, but I'm drawing on Ron Chenow's Alexander Hamilton, which um, I actually read when I was wrongfully detained in Montgomery County, Maryland. So now I had, in an earlier video, I had mentioned that I had mentioned the necessary and proper clause, which Alexander Hamilton helped expound on. However, I had incorrectly attributed the necessary and proper clause in one of our amendments. No, and I specifically mentioned the Ninth and Tenth Amendments. No, the necessary and proper clause, which is also called the elastic clause, is found in our Constitution. It's in Article 1 of Section 8, Clause 18. That's where the necessary and proper clause is in. And, so it's basically, it gives, and Alexander Hamilton expounded on this, it gives broad interpretation, broad powers, to Congress to be able to make laws that are necessary and proper in order to exercise its enumerated powers, which are in the Constitution. So those are the implied powers of Congress. So let me just clarify what the Ninth Amendment is. The Ninth Amendment, that's part of our, that's basically restricting government's power concerning our rights, because remember, the Constitution, through the amendments, it lists a number of rights that we have as citizens of America. And for instance, there's the First Amendment, which gives us freedom of speech. So the Ninth Amendment was basically saying that, that the fact that certain rights have not been listed, they're not, Americans haven't given up those rights, and those rights still exist, and the government still cannot violate them. That's what the Ninth Amendment is saying. It's just saying that the list of rights in the Constitution are not exhaustive, right? There are other rights, and they're retained even though they have not been listed. And various courts have interpreted these rights. For instance, there's right of privacy. Right of privacy is not listed in the Constitution, but it exists. And of course, the landmark case of Griswold versus Connecticut, which says that, which banned, the state from, which said the states cannot ban the use of contraceptives because, we have, privacy in our marriage. So that's right to privacy. Griswold versus Connecticut. It's, people have cited it as an example of the Ninth Amendment. There's a right to travel. That's a right that we have, but it's not listed. A right to vote, right? A right to raise a family. So that's what the Ninth Amendment is saying, that the fact that rights have not been expressly listed in our Constitution, it does not mean that those rights don't exist and that the government can violate them. The government cannot violate these rights. They still exist. That's the Ninth Amendment. And the 10th Amendment is basically delineating the powers of federal and the states, right? So it's saying that those powers that have not been delegated to Congress, to the government, the powers that have not been delegated to the government or expressly prohibited to the states are retained by the state or the people. So that's the 9th and 10th Amendment. I wanted to clarify that. And the implied the powers of the necessary and proper clause, which is also called the elastic clause that I was mentioning, that's found in Article 1 of Section 8, Clause 18. That's the necessary and proper clause. So what happened was, historically, Alexander Hamilton, of course, wanted a strong federal government, and of course he wanted a national bank. You're right, he wanted to create national credit, and so he wanted to establish a national bank. And as I said, he had the ear of George Washington, so he'd gone to George Washington, but George Washington said, well, he should make strong arguments, demonstrating that that in fact the federal government has the power to create such a national bank. So it's called our first national bank. And so Hamilton, he argues extensively. He makes arguments in his Federalist Papers, and that's Federalist Papers 31 to 36. He argues regarding the broad interpretation of federal power, and he's saying that that government, that the Congress does have these implied powers to create laws or institutions that will enable it, right, to exercise its enumerated powers. And so that's a necessary and proper clause. That's basically what it's saying. And so George Washington was convinced, and so Alexander Hamilton, the government, we went on to create, the first national bank. Of course, the opponents of this, or as usual, were Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. So interestingly, though, this went on. It was supported constitutionally by Chief Justice John Marshall after Alexander Hamilton had passed, but Chief Justice John Marshall would go on to cite Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Papers. That's from 31 to 36, and he would say that, well, that Congress does have these necessary and proper powers to be able to create laws or institutions that were conducive, that were needful, that could be used to facilitate the exercise of its enumerated powers. So in terms of the creation of a national bank, it's stated in the Constitution that Congress is able to tax, it's able to borrow money, and it's able to coin money. And which institution is best able to do that? A bank. So it says, well, it is implied that the Congress has the power to make a law to create such a bank, that will enable it to tax, to borrow money, and to coin money. And so in McCulloch versus the state of Maryland, McCulloch versus Maryland, it's a case of 1819. It's a landmark case, and Chief Justice John Marshall, our longest Chief Justice, he went on to actually reference and cite Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Papers 31 to 36. So you see, Alexander Hamilton was a very great, very significant man in the philosophy of government that we have today, and in the way our leaders, our founding fathers, our chief justices, our presidents thought. And even his detractors, even those who did not agree with him, they would eventually exercise Alexander Hamilton's vision of a very energetic, dynamic president who exercised robust powers. Thomas Jefferson would do it when he executed the Louisiana Purchase without actually first seeking consent and agreement from Congress. Andrew Jackson would do this when he wanted to use federal troops to and the force bill to go ahead and enforce federal laws. That's the tariffs of abominations against southern states, including South Carolina. Andrew Jackson, of course, he also did it rather uh, in a rather profane manner, as he threatened to actually hang, the nullifiers. And so these were people who opposed his philosophy of government, but they nevertheless they still ended up exercising his idea, his vision of a powerful federal government. Now, on the downside, there was something he did, and he wanted a strong standing army. This was something that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison also resisted. But very early on in the Republic, of course, uh, the federal government had assumed the debts of the states. But how was the federal government going to now raise money to pay off these loans, these debts? And of course, it was through taxes. So in the beginning, he persuaded Congress. That's Alexander Hamilton. He persuaded Congress to pass these excise duties on distilled spirits. Now there was resistance, particularly in Western Pennsylvania, and so there was a rebellion against. It was called the Whiskey Rebellion against these taxes, these excise duties, because they were the federal government was was taxing these distilled spirits, which was very important to the economy of these more agrarian rural parts, places that were remote. And so Alexander Hamilton convinced George Washington to actually lead troops, federal troops, to go and crush the rebellion. And George Washington actually did that. So it's the only time in our history that a sitting president went to lead troops in order to crush a rebellion. So George Washington led about 13,000 troops, federal troops, to go and crush the rebellion in Western Pennsylvania. So Alexander Hamilton is a bit unpopular for that, but he did succeed in having, in demonstrating the authority of the federal government to make its laws and enforce its laws in the states. So that's Alexander Hamilton. It was very significant, and in subsequent years, concerning his ideas on taxing, I want to just quickly mention something that happened in subsequent years. I want to bring us to the 20th century. Alexander Hamilton was big on tariffs, that we should, that the federal government should raise tariffs so that it could protect local industries, and mainly these local industries were in the north. Now, in the 20th century, a modification of his vision would eventually create a huge problem. So there was something called scientific taxation, which was propounded by another Treasury Secretary we had called Andrew Mellon. Andrew Mellon is of the Mellon Bank, and he came from a prosperous banking family. He had been a bank exec president, but in his later years he went into politics and he became Treasury Secretary for about 11 years. He served President Harding, President Coolidge, and President Hoover. These were all Republicans, and he was our Treasury Secretary at the time of when the Great Depression started in 1929. And people have attributed the depression to some of these the ideas of and policies of Andrew Mellon concerning taxation. So the Republican Party had come up with this concept, especially espoused by Andrew Mellon, that during Alexander Hamilton's time, we didn't have the individual tax. Now, the individual tax came about, it became law with the 16th Amendment in 1913 under President Woodrow Wilson. In the past, we've had temporary, ad hoc income taxes during war, right? But now in 1913, through the 16th Amendment, it became a permanent feature, the federal income tax. Now, Andrew Mellon was of the opinion, because the Republicans were against taxation, they wanted to limit taxation. The Republicans liked tariffs. So during Woodrow Wilson's time, there was some kind of compromise that, okay, well, they could limit tariffs and, raise taxes in another way. Federal government could raise money in another way through these federal income taxes rather than through tariffs. Now, these federal income taxes, however, were very high. During Woodrow Wilson's time, the highest marginal tax rate was 91%. But these taxes were on the richest people, the wealthiest people in the United States. Andrew Mellon was one of the wealthiest men, and his friends, of course, they didn't like these taxes, so they decided to lower taxes. Andrew Mellon argued that, well, if you actually lower taxes on the wealthy, especially, if you lowered taxes, that it will still generate higher federal receipts and revenues. Because he said, if the wealthy have money that's not taxed, they will be able to invest. Right, they'd be able to invest their money that's not taxed into the economy, right? And which they did. In fact, there were larger revenues when taxes were reduced during the tenure of Andrew Mellon as Treasury Secretary. However, it fueled speculation, right? It fueled excessive speculation in the stock market, and of course, the stock market would eventually crash. And we had the Great Depression. This is an interesting thing for me to talk about because I used to be, at one time, I was a financial advisor. I've been a stockbroker. And so something we normally learn when you're a stockbroker is the cycles, and you learn about the Great Depression and all the laws that came about, what caused the stock market crash and all that. So we go through a historical analysis of the stock markets, the rise and falls and things like that. So you can see an extreme of this philosophy of taxation, when Andrew Mellon, as Treasury Secretary, decides that, well, we're going to practice this scientific taxation, which is like a trickle down, the notions of Reagan's trickle down economy, right? So it comes from Andrew Mellon's period. And lower taxes on the wealthy, it will allow them to have money, right? Free money available money to be able to invest in the economy, invest in businesses and things like that. And so they invested excessively in stock markets, speculating. It actually fueled excessive speculation, and it led to the crash of the economy and the Great Depression. Well, I've tried to go into Alexander Hamilton to just discuss about him and how great he was for our not just our economy, but the philosophy of our government, how our government is structured. And you can see the great Chief Justice John Marshall citing him in McCulloch versus Maryland of 1819 regarding the necessary and proper clause for Congress to actually create institutions such as a bank, a national bank, for Congress to be able to carry out its powers, its enumerated powers, to be able to tax, borrow money, and coin money. And of course, as I said, Alexander Hamilton was a very significant person in our Constitution, and not just our Constitution, our form of government, our way of life. And he believed in a very strong central government, and that's what we have today. The United States, so his vision was executed, not the vision of the Democratic Republican Party. They did get some things, but mainly the United States government has a very strong federal government, and of course it's a leading federal government in the world. It's a leading nation in the world today, and many other countries have actually emulated its form of government and its philosophy of government as defined by Alexander Hamilton. I'm one of those people. I'm originally from Nigeria. I'm an American citizen, but Nigeria actually copied the United States, the form of the United States government in our what was called our Second Republic, and of course the current republic we have. We we have a civilian form of government now, and we've borrowed our constitution and our form of government, you know, uh, in consonance, with the way the American government is fashioned. So Alexander Hamilton is very significant for that, and we owe our philosophy of government, our structure, to the great mind, the energy and brilliance and the selflessness of Alexander Hamilton. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I also draw attention to color of law violations that I'm suffering in Montgomery County, Maryland, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the court. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.